Street John, Danish West Indies, 1733. The night hung heavy under a pale, watchful moon, while the whitewashed houses of the masters echoed with wine, laughter, and music. From the shadows stepped a woman. Her name was Breffu, an enslaved Aquamu torn from West Africa. In her hand a blade, in her chest a fire. She moved toward the house of Piet Croyer. Within hours, 5 lives would fall. 2 masters, 3 neighbors. From that act, an island would ignite in rebellion. This is Breffu's story. The Caribbean sun was merciless on Street John. Its light did not shimmer with promise. It scorched, revealing every scar left by conquest. The Danish West Indies in the early 18th century was no paradise for those bound in chains. Sugar was the island's gold, human bodies its engine. Day after day, men and women bent under the lash, cutting cane stalks sharp as knives, their sweat feeding the coffers of Copenhagen merchants who would never touch the soil they claimed to own. Breffu had arrived here not by choice, but by force. She was Aquamu, taken from the river valleys and bustling trade cities of West Africa, lands alive long before Europeans arrived. Like many, she was seized in wars stoked by the slave trade, packed into a ship where the horizon vanished, where her name might have been the only possession to survive the crossing. On Street John, chains did not end with iron. They were woven into daily life. Waking before dawn, laboring until night, eating barely enough to endure, living only enough to produce more labor. The fields broke bodies swiftly. Disease, exhaustion, and punishment ensured that survival itself was an act of quiet rebellion. Plantation owners lived on hilltops in whitewashed houses, looking down at the land as if it were an empire carved for them alone. They spoke of order, but it was an order written in blood. Africans were not people to them, only property, numbered on ledgers beside barrels of sugar and crates of rum. Yet beneath this bleakness, whispers survived. Faiths crossed oceans, Aquamu gods, ancestral spirits, the rhythms of drums that could not be silenced. Breffu carried those echoes. Each day she walked the cane fields, her shadow stretching long under the sun, unseen as human, yet undeniably present, unbroken. To the masters, she was nothing more than another set of hands. But in her silence, in the way she bore pain without breaking, there was a hidden current. Beneath the surface of the island, resentment thickened like storm clouds. No empire can endure forever against the weight of despair transformed into rage. Breffu had been forced into chains, yet chains could forge weapons. And in her heart, something was being tempered, not submission, but fire. By day, her life was written in routine: cut, carry, endure. Her back bent under loads of cane. Her skin bore the marks of heat and labor. Around her, voices of fellow captives spoke in fragments of different tongues, patched together into a language of survival. Laughter was rare, but it existed, faint sparks of humanity in the darkness. Yet Breffu herself lived in shadows, not shadows of night, but the deeper kind imposed by a world that refused to see her as human. She passed before her master's eyes each day, yet never once was her gaze returned as equal. She was like a shadow cast by the Caribbean sun, undeniable, always present, but never acknowledged as real. She had no legal self. She could not own land, could not speak against injustice, could not protect her own body from the whims of her owners. To exist in such a state was to feel erased while still alive. And yet invisibility gave her something dangerous: the power to listen, to observe. In silence, she saw the habits of those who claimed ownership of her, the masters who drank too long into the night, the overseers who quarreled when drunk, the neighbors who boasted of wealth but feared every whisper of unrest. Breffu learned the architecture of their arrogance, and in knowing it, she found its cracks. Her nights were long, restless. She would sit by dim candlelight, sometimes alone, sometimes with those who trusted her. Whispers moved carefully like threads of smoke. To dream of freedom was treason. To bury the dream was death of the soul. For Breffu, memory itself was an act of defiance, remembering the rivers of Awamu, the songs of her people, the dignity she had once known. She was a woman in shadows. But shadows move, they lengthen, shift, merge into darkness. In time, shadows can conceal a storm before it breaks. The island believed Breffu was silent, submissive, erased. Yet beneath her silence, a fire grew, and soon the world that denied her existence would feel the weight of her presence. The hilltop houses of Street John glowed with candlelight as the sun dipped into the sea. While the enslaved collapsed into their cabins after a day of labor, the masters opened their doors to music, laughter, and overflowing goblets of imported wine. The wealth of sugar flowed not only into barrels, but into their feasts. Among the most powerful was Piet Croyer. He was not merely a man, but a symbol, an overseer whose authority stretched like a shadow across the plantations. His whitewashed home stood firm, shutters painted bright, a beacon of European order imposed upon Caribbean soil. At his side, his wife wore silks that shimmered in the firelight, garments woven far from the land that paid for them. Together they embodied the illusion of permanence, as if the order of their world could never falter. Then there were the Vanstel family, neighbors close enough that their laughter could carry across the night breeze. Wealthy, proud of their lineage, certain of their invulnerability, their tables overflowed with imported meats, fine wines, and porcelain plates. Outside, the fields produced the true harvest, the broken bodies of those enslaved. To them, cane stalks were no different than the people who cut them, things to be consumed until emptied. As Christmas neared, the masters' homes became stages for arrogance. Lanterns glowed in windows, violins sang in halls, voices toasted another year of prosperity. Yet beyond those walls, in cabins of rough wood, another kind of silence grew. Enslaved men and women heard the music carried by the wind. To them it was not joy. It was insult, a reminder that their suffering built the very feasts they could never taste. Breffu was among those who listened from the dark. Invisible in the night, her heart measured every sound. The laughter that disregarded their humanity, the careless words reducing them to tools. She understood that power flaunted so openly could also be fragile. The louder the masters celebrated, the more they revealed their blindness. A feast is meant to display control, but control is always an illusion. Under the golden light of the masters' homes, the island itself held its breath. What they called celebration, others would remember as the calm before the storm. In the silence after the feasts, once the masters had fallen into wine-soaked sleep, whispers traveled through the cabins. Not loud, for even walls seemed to listen, but steady words of defiance, of possibilities, of names remembered from Africa. Breffu's voice was among them. She was not the only one to feel the fire, but she gave it shape around her. Trusted allies leaned close, faces lit only by faint embers. Plans could not be written, parchment betrayed, but they lived in memory, passed from lips to ears, heavy with survival. The rebellion they envisioned was not born from sudden rage. It had been planted long before, in every lash of the whip, every burial of a child, every humiliation endured. Now those seeds sprouted. Breffu and her comrades knew the risks, torture if discovered, death if defeated. But what was life under chains if not another form of dying? They spoke of timing, of striking when the masters were most vulnerable. They spoke of fire, the great equalizer that could turn whitewashed homes into ash. They spoke of courage, the kind that was contagious, spreading like wind over cane fields. In their whispers, one phrase repeated like a heartbeat. A single spark can set the island aflame. Breffu carried those words within her. She had no written manifesto, no crown, no title. What she held was deeper, the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose, and thus everything to fight for. The night grew still. Outside, the island seemed unchanged. Waves lapped the shore, palm leaves rustled, stars scattered across the sky. But within the silence, the future shifted. A plan had taken root, and once planted, no empire could ever unmake it. Dawn broke slowly on the 23rd of November, 1733. The sky above Street John was brushed with pale light, a deceptive calm masking the storm hidden beneath. The masters slept soundly, confident that the day ahead would mirror every day before it. Fields worked, commands obeyed, wealth secured. But that morning would not belong to them. Breffu moved through the shadows with deliberate steps. The weight she carried was not only a blade, but the burden of generations torn from homelands, of children born into chains. Every footstep was both heavy and light. Heavy with danger, light with clarity of purpose. The house of Peter Croyer stood silent, shutters closed, halls still echoing laughter from the night before. Breffu entered not as a servant, but as something unseen for centuries, a woman about to turn despair into defiance. Inside, the stillness cracked, not with chaos or spectacle, but with the briefest of sounds. A startled cry, a muffled thud, the sputter of a candle struggling in its wax. Then silence, so complete it seemed unnatural, as though the island itself paused to listen. Two figures who had embodied mastery, Croyer and his wife, now lay still. Their power, built on cruelty and wealth, dissolved in moments. To the world outside, nothing yet had changed. But to those who had lived beneath their rule, a threshold had been crossed. Breffu emerged not with triumph, but with resolve. This act was not an end, but a beginning. She was no longer merely an enslaved woman from Aquamu. She had become a signal, a spark. In the cabins, whispers stirred. Something had happened, something unthinkable, something that proved chains could be broken. Fear mingled with exhilaration. Hope, fragile but undeniable, spread like the first tendrils of fire through dry cane fields. The island had woken to a different reality, and once awakened, it would not sleep again. The night had given Breffu her first strike. Now the morning carried her to another. The Vanstel house loomed close, a mansion of pride and arrogance. Its walls held wealth, portraits of ancestors, possessions imported from Europe, objects meant to remind the enslaved of distance, of power beyond reach. But walls, however thick, could not shield against the tide rising beneath them. Breffu led her allies toward the house with the certainty of someone who no longer feared death. The air was still yet charged, as if nature itself anticipated what would unfold. Inside, the Vanstels moved in their usual rhythms, confident, careless. They could not imagine the order of their world was cracking, but the strike came swift, like a storm breaking over calm waters. Again, there were no trumpets, no declarations, only sudden disruption. Footsteps where none were expected, voices raised in confusion, then silence cut short. 3 lives ended, and with them, the illusion of safety that had guarded every master's home on the island. The effect was greater than the act itself. Fear rippled outward across hills and fields, carried on whispers and rumors. If one house could fall, then all could fall. If one enslaved a woman could lead a blow against her masters, and chains were no longer unbreakable. Outside, the world seemed unchanged. The sun still rose. The sea still shimmered. The cane fields swayed in the breeze. Yet to those who had witnessed or heard, everything looked different. The houses of power were no longer fortresses. They were tinder waiting for fire. Breffu stood not as a shadow, but as a flame around her. The silence of obedience had been replaced by the silence of anticipation. The rebellion was no longer a dream whispered in darkness. It had begun, and nothing could return the island to what it had been. Flame does not spread politely. It leaps, it consumes, it transforms. What began with Breffu's blade soon became something larger, something no one could contain. Word of the strikes against the Croyers and the Vanstels moved faster than the sunrise. By midday, whispers had turned to shouts, and the island itself seemed to tremble. Plantations that once echoed with the crack of the overseer's whip now thundered with footsteps. Men and women breaking free, joining the tide. Sugar fields that had swallowed sweat and blood for years erupted in fire. Cane stalks, tall and dry, caught quickly, sending smoke curling into the sky like dark banners of defiance. For the enslaved, the rebellion was more than vengeance. It was the sudden taste of air unchained. Some seized tools of labor, machetes, axes, torches, and turned them into weapons. Others carried nothing but their voices, crying out in unity, proof that they were not shadows, but people, alive, unyielding, unbroken. Forts and outposts shook. At Coral Bay, rebels seized a garrison, raising their flag over a stronghold that had once symbolized foreign rule. Masters who had long spoken with authority now cowered, sending desperate calls for aid across the sea. Danish officials, stunned by the speed and ferocity of the uprising, realized their colony was crumbling beneath them. Breffu stood at the center, no longer hidden in shadows, but elevated in the eyes of her people. Though she had no crown, no throne, she held something far stronger, legitimacy born from action. She had struck first, and in striking proved that resistance was not only possible, it was inevitable. The island blazed, not just with fire, but with meaning. Every field lit, every plantation seized, was a sentence rewritten in the book of history. For once, it was not the masters who defined the story, it was the enslaved, carving their truth into the soil with flame. The rebellion did not promise victory. It was raw, precarious, dangerous. But for those who lived through it, even a single day of standing free was worth more than a lifetime in chains. Street John, once a jewel of the Danish crown, now glowed under smoke and fire. And though empires would send ships and soldiers, the island would never again be the same. Empires, however, do not surrender easily. News of the uprising traveled quickly across the sea, from Street John, from Guadeloupe, from far-off Denmark itself. Orders were given: crush the rebellion, no matter the cost. Ships appeared on the horizon, their sails pale against the sun. Soldiers disembarked, Danish and French alike, marching in rows, muskets gleaming. They carried not only weapons, but the weight of Europe's pride, determined to prove that no colony could rise against its masters. The rebels, though fierce, were outmatched. They had courage, numbers, and the will to fight, but lacked the endless powder and steel that foreign armies brought. Yet they did not surrender. Instead, they melted into forests and hills, turning terrain into ally. Twisting paths, dense trees, hidden caves offered refuge. The land that had once been gunfire from muskets mingled with the lingering haze of burned plantations. Each skirmish was costly. For every soldier who fell, rebels fell too. Some cut down, some captured, many facing horrors worse than death. Yet Breffu pressed forward. She understood what was at stake. This was not merely a fight for freedom, but a statement against the system that had stolen lives for centuries. To fight, even in the face of certain defeat, was to deny erasure. But the hunters pressed closer. European flags rose again over captured forts. Patrols swept through villages and cabins, dragging survivors into chains. Fear spread, not of rebellion itself, but of its suppression. The tide was shifting, yet even as armies advanced, the rebellion left scars no musket could erase. Houses once symbols of power now stood in ruins. Fields once green with cane were black with ash. And in the hearts of those who fought, a truth remained. Chains could be broken, even if only for a time. The hunters believed they were reclaiming order. In truth, they were chasing shadows, for the rebellion had already burned its way into memory. The forests of Street John became both shield and prison. For weeks, Breffu and her allies evaded capture, striking when possible, vanishing when soldiers pressed near. Yet the net tightened. Danish and French forces, armed with cannons and muskets, advanced steadily, determined to smother the rebellion. For Breffu, every sunrise carried the same weight. Fight, retreat, endure. She knew the rebellion could not last forever. Supplies dwindled, safe places shrank, allies were hunted one by one. Yet surrender was unthinkable. To live again in chains was a death more unbearable than the grave. At last, surrounded in a ravine with 23 companions, the end came into sight. Soldiers drew closer, their shouts echoing through the trees, boots crushing leaves like a drumbeat of conquest. The rebels looked to Breffu, not with despair but with solemn clarity. She had led them this far. She would lead them to the end. There are moments in history when silence speaks louder than words, when an act of refusal resounds across centuries. Breffu chose that silence. She would not be paraded as a captured criminal, nor displayed as proof of European triumph. She would leave on her own terms, denying her enemies the satisfaction of spectacle. One by one, those around her followed her choice. It was not defeat, it was declaration. In their final moments, they proclaimed with their lives, "We do not belong to chains." When the soldiers reached the ravine, they found only stillness. The rebellion's leaders had slipped beyond their grasp, vanishing into the only freedom left to them. Muskets and bayonets could not claim victory. The cost had already been paid. Breffu's body was never honored, never given a grave with a name. To the Danish, she was only a rebel, erased from record. But in truth, she became something far greater, an ember in the memory of a people, a spark that empires could not extinguish. Her last stand was measured not in territory, but in dignity kept. On that day, Breffu proved that freedom is not merely a place or a possession. It is a choice, even in the face of death. History records the rebellion of Street John as a disturbance, a crime against empire. Officials marked it with numbers: plantations lost, barrels of sugar destroyed, soldiers killed. Yet behind the ledgers lies another truth. Names like Breffu's live not in ink, but in whispers, in memories passed from generation to generation. She left no statue, no grave, no monument. Colonizers erased her from their chronicles, but erasure is never complete. In the Caribbean, in stories told in shadows and songs, her name still burns. Breffu is remembered not as a criminal, but as a woman who chose resistance when silence meant the death of the soul. Her life forces us to ask, who holds the burden of guilt? The woman who raised a blade against oppression, or the system that reduced human beings to property? Breffu's rebellion may have ended in blood and silence, but it carried a message no empire could bury. Freedom is worth even the final breath.